I've studied it, restudied it several times, and I know that Jesus, there's nothing that he taught or said that doesn't have a real meaning and has a real sense of importance. And so I thought it behooved me to try to come to some kind of an understanding of exactly what is the purpose. And I think as you study the parable more and more and more, you come to the conclusion that it does have a real meaning. I want to go over to the 16th chapter of the book of Luke and read the parable itself through verse 8. And our lesson will really be concerning verses 9 through 12. But I want to read the parable in the beginning before we begin. And he said unto one of his disciples, There was a certain rich man which had a steward, and the same was accused of him that he had wasted his goods. And he called him and said unto him, How is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, that thou mayest no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me my stewardship. I cannot dig. To beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, How much owest thou to my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, Take thy bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. Then said he to another, And how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said unto him, Take thy bill, and write 80. And the Lord commended the unjust steward, because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. Sometimes if you read a study of parables, people, scholars who've written books, and you can take them for what they're worth, but they say something that I think makes a great deal of sense. They say that, in fact, sometimes you can't get too caught up in a parable, in the specifics of it. There is something that's sometimes referred to as parabolic drapery, which means there's something that's intended to convey a message, but the thing itself is not of any significance or any degree of importance. I think when you begin to look at what he did and try to analyze it as to whether it was ethical, whether it was moral, you kind of lose sight of the point that's made. Because beginning in verse 9, he then makes a point. Now, I've entitled this lesson, Does It Matter How We Live Life? Using a question. And we're looking at verse 9 through verse 13 of this particular chapter. Now, understand that when I make this statement, I'm talking about your physical life. I'm talking about the time you spend from the time of your birth until the time of your death. That's the time you spend here upon the earth. And of course, it does make a great deal of difference. Jesus makes several points in this lesson and in other places, and we're going to talk about that in a few moments. But before we do, let's take the time to read what Jesus said was the application of the parable. And I say unto you, make yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who shall commit to your trust the true riches? For if ye have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. A lot of people look at that and they think of it as being contradictory, especially because Jesus twice uses the expression mammon of unrighteousness in the application of the parable. But I think sometimes you really need to stop and think about exactly what was it that Jesus was trying to impart to you? Exactly what was he trying to say to you? You do realize that there are people who have a doctrinal position that says it doesn't matter how you live life. Their belief is that anything that has to do with the physical has no connection, nor implication, nor any kind of effect upon your spiritual condition. Their idea is that only things that are spiritual are meaningful. Things that are physical are not. And what you do in your physical life is of absolutely no importance. Now, believe it or not, there are people who hold to that position. But understand, that's not what Jesus is saying. He's not saying that what you do in life doesn't matter. You can do whatever you please as long as your spiritual life is accepted before God. I remember years ago, and I've talked about this before, back, I believe it was in the 80s, when they were having all the problem of pedophilia in the Catholic Church. And the Archbishop of Boston came out and actually said in a television interview that if there was a priest who was involved in pedophilia with boys within the congregation, that it didn't have any effect upon how he performed his official duties. Now, that's really kind of what that comes down to. In other words, how you live your life doesn't matter. It's just the spiritual things that do. Well, that's not true. And I believe that can be very easily proven. You know, we're not of this world. We're not. We're in it. We live in it. And there's no question about that. So let's think about that a little bit. Let's think about even Jesus. Jesus, according to John 1, verse 1 and 2, existed from eternity. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. But that same Jesus, who had existed from eternity, I don't know exactly how to express that better than that, from eternity, meaning there was not a time that He did not exist. Even He, when He came to this earth, in Luke chapter 2 and verse 47, had a mother and had a supposed father, as some passages actually say. And when He had been lost in the city of Jerusalem, and they sought for Him and they found Him, and they heard Him talking with the lawyers in the temple, when they saw Him, they were amazed. And His mother said unto Him, Son, why hast thou thus dealt with us? Behold, thy father and I have sought thee sorely. And He said unto them, How is it that you sought me? Wist you not that I must be about my Father's business? And they understood not the saying which He spake unto them. And He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject unto them. But His mother kept all these sayings in her heart. So the fact is that Jesus was not of this world in a way that you and I are not. He was an eternal deity who came to this earth as a human being and was subject to a father and mother just like all others. So He had to live this life in a way that was acceptable in that fleshly relationship, even though He was in fact the Son of God. Now think about this one. When you look on, Jesus had all the same physical needs that every other human being has. I mean, all the things that you need, He needed. He needed air to breathe. He needed food to eat. He needed water to drink. He had all the problems that other people have. If He cut His finger, it hurt. There wasn't anything about Him that was different than you and I as far as His fleshly life was concerned. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Jesus Christ, who being the form of God thought it not robbery, or thought it not a thing to be grasped to be equal with God, but made Himself of no reputation, took upon Him the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So when you look at Jesus, He was not of this world in a way that's even beyond what we're not of this world. And yet He Himself, as it related to this earthly existence that He had, lived within the confines of God's law concerning it. Now let's think a little further along those lines and consider it. He too was dependent upon things just like you and I. When you go back and you look at Jesus as he was in the wilderness fasting for 40 days and 40 nights in Matthew chapter 4, and the devil came into him and tempted him. A part of the statement there is pretty simple, and yet, being a great understatement, it expresses a truth. When he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward and hungered. Would you not think that any human being would be hungry if he hadn't eaten for 40 days and 40 nights? He wasn't immune to anything. He was in this world, but he was not of this world. Just like, in a sense, you and I are not. Now, we're not eternal beings in the sense that we didn't exist in eternity, but we are eternal beings in the terms that we won't have an end to our lives. It will go on. But you see that we are of this world. We're here. There are things that affect us, things that we're dependent upon, but we're not of it. We're in it, but we're not of it. And I think that's something that's important. Now, we looked this morning, we really kind of brushed over it because of the way we went through the class this morning. But even there in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, in verse 29 through 31, there's a statement made that's very interesting. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. And I think he's talking specifically about our lives. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as those that have none. Why? Well, and they that weep as though they that weep not. And they that rejoice as though they rejoice not. And they that buy as though they possess not. All the things that pertain to this world have an impact upon us until we pass out of it. And once they put us in the cemetery, our remains, and our spirit has departed our body, then those things in the world have absolutely no relationship to us at all. Period. They don't have any relationship to us. And that's what he's saying. So whatever your life is like, it really doesn't make any difference when it comes to the end of it, because it will be the same for everyone. As someone said, no matter how much your net worth is, everybody possesses the same amount of dirt when they die. And that's the truth. And that's what he's telling you. He's telling you have to be really careful how you view physical things. They're a part of your obedience to God because you're in the world and he regulates how you deal with it. But they're not really a part of who you are. When you think about it, in death, everyone's equal in the sense that all the things that relate to them really have nothing to do with that. And so he goes on to say here in verse 31, and they that use this world as not abusing it. In other words, they don't misunderstand what it's all about. For the fashion of this world passeth away. Just remember that. When you put a lot of value on physical things, remember there are none of them that will have any relationship to you at all the moment your spirit passes from your body, period. And that's the truth. And that's what he's telling you. But as long as you're living in this world, you are connected to them. And they do have something to do with you. And that's something that we need to stop and think about. You know, the key to understanding the parable is, I think, pretty simple. We can't love mammon, but we must use mammon. Now, there's a difference between loving it and using it. Over the years, I've heard so many people say that money is the root of all evil. That is absolute falsehood. It is not the truth. It is not stated by God. It is not so. When you begin to think about money, you do realize that it is an inanimate object that has no abilities of its own. The only thing that money does is what you do with it. It's kind of like when you think about guns, it's kind of the same way. What's a gun? Well, it's a piece of metal. What does it do bad? Nothing, unless somebody uses it to do bad. What does it do good? Nothing, unless somebody uses it to do good. All physical things are like that. What determines whether they are good or bad has to do with how they're used. And it doesn't have to do with the thing itself. And that's what Jesus is trying to get these disciples, and thus you and I as further disciples, to understand. Now, somebody says, well, why do you say make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness? Well, pretty obvious. When you begin to think about how you serve God, physical things have anything to do with your service to God? You believe they do? You believe the things of this world have to do with your service to God? Well, let's think about it a moment. I want to look at some contrasts, some ideas here for a moment. I want to turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 6. This is the passage that says the love of money is the root of all evil in verse 10. It does not say money is the root of all evil. That is not a statement that God has anywhere made in the inspired text. He did say the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. But what's really interesting is to go down in the reading to verse 17, when Timothy is encouraged to speak to Christians who are wealthy and say this to them: charge them that are rich in this world, that they be not high-minded. Why? Because that has nothing to do with spirituality. That they be not high-minded, nor trust in uncertain riches. Why? Because they're going to own them as long as they're living. The moment they die, they don't. But in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. So all these things that they have, the money that they possess, God allowed them to have it. Remember something that Jesus said. Just for a moment, I want you to go back to Luke chapter 16 and see what he said. In Luke chapter 16 and verse 12, he said, if you have not been faithful to that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? Now think about it. He's talking about physical mammon. Do you actually own anything? You know, we often talk about what we own. Do you really own anything? You say, oh yeah. What about the day of your death? Do you really own anything? The answer is no. No. You own nothing. It really, you have the use of those things lent to you by the Lord for as long as you're here upon the earth. But the moment that your spirit departs the body and you're no longer here on the earth, then those things are not lent to you anymore. Another person takes charge of them. And that's what he's talking about. And that's what he's saying to you. So he said, you keep them, you keep it in perspective. You keep it in perspective. Make sure that you understand it. But you go back over here again to this book of 1 Timothy chapter 6, and you see what he then says in verse 17. Charge them that they not trust in uncertain riches. They don't trust him. But what do they do with them? That they do good. That they may be rich in good works. Ready to distribute. Willing to communicate. Laying up in store for themselves a good foundation. How do they do that? By the way they use their money. People don't like to think about that, but that's the truth. Laying up in store a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life. So you see a contrast of ideas. What he's saying is very clear. Money is an inanimate object that can do neither good nor bad. And the only thing that determines whether it's accomplishing good or bad is how you use it. And that's what he said. And so, in effect, when you look at that parable, that's really what Jesus is trying to teach you. We get too caught up sometimes in all that went on there, and we don't look at what the conclusion that Jesus reached in the end about making friends of the unrighteous mammon. That he's trying to get to the point that you use it for good. Just think about today, we talk about the opioid crisis in our country and how terrible it is. You ever had surgery? How'd you like to do that without the opioids? Give that a shot. Now, I know now they've developed some other things, But even still, one of the things that you see more often than anything will be fentanyl. I mean, it's used just constantly in hospitals. And it really accomplishes something good because it allows them to do a lot of things they couldn't do otherwise. But at the same time, it's responsible. I saw the other day 28,000 deaths last year. Is that right? Responsible for 28,000 deaths when it was misused. Is that right? I believe that's correct. But is it bad or good? Well, it depends on how it's used. It depends on how it's used. And so we need to understand that point. Now my finger's getting a little strong there. See if I can get it to do what I want to do. Let's think about marriage. Jesus talked about that already. Let's talk about it here. Jesus made very clear in Matthew chapter 22, Mormons notwithstanding. Mormons believe, of course, marriage is for eternity. Of course, they do believe you have to be married in the temple in Salt Lake City. But on the other hand, they kind of give you an out there. If you hadn't been able to get out there and get married, you send your name out there and two people stand up in your name and they can be married for you until you're married. Or if you're dead already, they come and get your names off the tombstones and send it out there and pay people to stand up for them and marry them. So they have some ways around it. But the truth is stated by Jesus. Jesus tells you the truth. He said, these people who were talking about marriage as if it continued beyond the grave, he said this to them: you do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. But while marriage is not something that will last for eternity, it is something that can be very valuable and very beneficial to us while we're here upon the earth. It can have a lot to do where we spend eternity, how we conduct ourselves within it, and other things. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1 and verse 2. Talking to wives, said, wives, be in subjection to your husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also, without the word, may be won with the conversation of the wife, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear. So it can affect your eternity. But then he says to the husbands, likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor to his wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life. Not that you'll be married in eternity, but both of you will have a lot to do by the way you conduct yourself towards your mate as to where you're going to spend eternity. That your prayers be not hindered. So again, what he's telling you is this. You're looking at something that has to do with this world. You live in this world. Marriage is part of it. It won't go beyond this world. It's kind of like I still remember, and it's kind of humorous to me. Brother Martin Dean knew a fella. His wife died, and he got married 4 months later. He was an older man. And there was a little old store down there where he lived. And everybody sat around back in those days on Coca-Cola cases talking and whittling and gossiping. And he walks in and everybody stopped because he just got married. And he started out the door and he realized there'd been total silence because everybody was shocked by his presence, I guess. And so he turned around and he looked at him and he said, you know what? She's just dead as she's ever going to be. And he was really right. I mean, it's the truth. Now, you might not like it. It might be too coarse for you. But he was right. From a scriptural viewpoint, your marriage ends at the time that you're one of those mates leaves this world. I mean, that's what Jesus said, and there's no getting around that. But do you then consider it to be unimportant? No. Extremely important. Think of the number of verses written about husbands how husbands will treat their wives, how wives will treat their husbands, and how they feel about each other, and all those things, and how important that relationship is. Why? Because it's that which belongs to another that you've been loaned for a period of time, if you please, the relationship of marriage, and how you deal with it, whether you meet God's conditions or you don't, is going to determine where you spend eternity. Now, you think about this. Think about jobs. Now, let's get down to even a little lower level. A lot of people, I'm around somebody a lot, and if you ask him about, do you enjoy doing that, his response is always the same, whatever he's doing. It's just a job. It's just a job. I kind of think, well, that's a bad way to live your life. It's just a job. I don't really enjoy anything. It's just a job. But I want to go back to what God said in Colossians chapter 3, verse 22. Now, I understand that a job is something that has to do with this world. And I understand that really when you get down to it and you think about your jobs, I guess everybody's job in here has to do with something temporal. You're making something that's physical, or you're servicing something that's physical, or you're providing a physical service. All the things that you do almost exclusively have to do with this world. So is it important how you conduct yourself within it? Well, how you conduct yourself is going to have a lot to do with where you spend eternity. Servants, obey in all things your masters, according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men. You ever work for somebody you didn't like? You ever worked at a job that you despised, and you felt oppressed, but you have a family to support, bills to pay, and so you go and you do it. And whatever happens, you just go along with it. Why? Well, because you kind of feel like you don't have any choice. But at the same time, you have to realize this. Kind of transpose that a little bit and think about what he said. Just think about, I'm obeying the Lord. And then go back and ask yourself the question, you think the Lord looked forward to the cross that he died on? You think your job's any worse than that? And you remember the prayer before Jesus died when he said, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. And you thinking, my job is the worst thing ever happened. No, it's not the worst thing ever happened. So he said, you just kind of consider that you have an obligation to God and kind of look at that in this way and not look at it as if you're humoring somebody that you really have kind of grown to not like much. Knowing that of the Lord you receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done. There's no respect of persons. Now, when you look at all that, you see that your job's a temporal thing. It's a part of the unrighteous mammon world that we live in. We live in the world, but we're not of the world. And this is another passage that deals with that subject and tries to make us to understand something that Jesus was saying in that parable of the steward. He wasn't really praising the behavior specifically. What he was really saying was that you have to use this world because it is a tool. Think about government. You like yours? Sometimes you might not. But, on the other hand, think about this. Here's what God said in Romans 13. And remember something. When Paul wrote this, the Roman Empire ruled the world. He was actually in subjection to a Roman emperor that eventually killed him. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. That's a pretty straightforward passage. And what it's getting at is being in subjection to physical governments that rule over you has to do with your relationship with God, and therefore it has to do with where you're going to spend eternity. So while it's, you look at this world and you look at all the things of it, and how you conduct yourself does have something to do with your relationship with God. It does. Now, these are just 4 examples. We could go on and look at others, but these are 4. And we have to understand that. We have to keep that in mind. I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of what Jesus is really trying to get across. What he's really trying to get across is telling you that this life is something that's really a proving ground. Let me ask you something. You ever thought about professional athletes, college athletes, high school athletes, any athletes, but specifically professional ones. They paid well. You ever think about if you looked at a professional athlete, professional football, let's take it because they only play, I think, 16 games a year. I think that's what they're going to play this year, 16 games. And you say, well, they play 16 games. Surely you're not naive enough to believe that's all they do. Surely. You do realize you're talking about people who basically 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, are preparing for 16 games. And everything they're doing, their diet, their exercise, everything they're doing points to that. The only thing that really makes any difference is the day of the game. I understand that. But without all the other things, there wouldn't be a game. And there wouldn't be the performance there is. It's a little bit like life. All these things we look at are pretty meaningless. Your job, how you get along with people, doesn't make too much difference except for one thing. God is telling you how to conduct yourself, and this is a proving ground as to who's going to be saved and who's not. Kind of like a professional athlete, if he were to go to practice and never put forth any effort, he probably wouldn't play. A Christian says, this world has nothing to do with me, I'm just going to do what I please. Not going to be pleasing in the sight of God. But now let's look at something, and I want to look at one point in this before we go on. Jesus said something in verse 12 that to me is such a meaningful statement. What do you really possess? What do you possess? Well, you may give me a whole list of things, but that's not true. You don't. There's only one thing that you make a final determination of. Now, you may have a will. Most of you probably do. And it dictates what's going to happen to all your physical assets. But even that can be contested and may not always turn out as you wish it would be. But I'm going to tell you something. What if you put something in your will about heaven? About your soul? Would that have any bearing? They'd probably look at you as a kook and a nut. The lawyer would probably say, you crazy. But Jesus would probably agree with him. Because here's what he said in verse 12. Here's the whole point of what he's trying to get at. If you have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? Think about it. Now, what's he getting at? Let's think for a moment. What do you possess? You possess one thing. I possess one thing. Everybody here possesses one thing. Every human being living on the face of the earth possesses one thing. You have ownership that will not be terminated of one thing. And one thing only. And that's your soul. That's the only thing you really possess. In James chapter 4 and verse 34, verse 14, excuse me, can't read. In James chapter 4 and verse 14, James issued that famous line. It's actually verse 13, 14. Go to now, ye that say today or tomorrow, we'll go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. You don't have any idea. None. No idea. Your life is a vapor, and basically everything in it is. And you don't have any control over it much. It kind of does what it wants to do. Now, you may try to do the best that you can. I imagine there's a whole lot of folks that lived in the southern part of what is now the United States that we then called the Confederate States that had huge fortunes that lost their value in a moment of time at Appomattox, don't you expect? I expect they did. But whatever happens to anything you've got, you don't. I mean, you have some control. Don't get me wrong. You need to make good plans. Try to act right. That's kind of what Jesus is telling you anyway. But you need to have an understanding. And the understanding is you don't actually control those things. Hebrews 9:27 is appointed man wants to die. When that death occurs, then all those other things you've been loaned by the Lord for whatever period of time that you live will no longer be yours. In death, every person is equal we will stand before God with one possession, and that's our soul. And that's it. Nothing else. Not a single, solitary thing. Don't believe that? Think back to Luke chapter 12. I'm going to read the whole parable. It's such a great parable. We've studied it so many times. You probably have it practically memorized, but that's all right. We're going to read it again because it's an important parable. Verse 16 through 21. The ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully. And he thought, like a lot of people think, he was in control. He thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, this will I do. I'll pull down my barns, build greater, and there will I bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, he's right about that, except he thought he controlled the destination of his soul, which he didn't. Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. You know what the Lord said to him? Have you ever paid attention to the language used there in verse 20? God said unto him, thy food, thy soul shall be required of thee. Notice what he said. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? That tells you that he didn't have permanent ownership of those things. He had them for a period of time. They were on loan. So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. You have one thing in your possession and one thing only. That's all you got. You have a soul. Everything else you're able to use, have some control over, not absolute control, still don't have that until the day you die. But at that time, who shall these things be? Now, you may dictate by your will who it's going to be. You may not. The court may decide. Somebody may contest your will and change it. And it may not turn out at all like you intended it to be because you don't have any control over it. But the thing is that there's one thing you possess. Now, we talked this morning in a lesson that talked about people need to really realize only one person can make decisions for them, can control their life, and that's them. You're the only person who's going to make a decision about your soul. What happens to your soul is up to you. And it's not something that's fickle. God has an absolute standard. If we meet His conditions, only He knows if we do or not perfectly. But if we meet His conditions, we'll be saved eternally. We control that. We don't control anything else. I hear people always talking about people being control freaks. And like that's some kind of a mental illness. Well, really it is, because nobody really controls anything except the soul. It's about all you control. You don't control anything else. You have nothing to do with it. A little bit sometimes. But overall, something we need to stop, we need to think about. So when I look at that parable, over the years it's always been a parable that's given me a lot of trouble. I've read it, I've studied it. I've kind of avoided it in preaching because I wasn't really sure. The more I've read it, I've become convinced that the only thing he's trying to get you to see is it does matter how you live life. It does matter how you relate to physical things. And the only reason it matters is because it demonstrates how you view your soul as it relates to God. Do you believe He's the controller of it or you? And that's what it's all about. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you need to respond to the gospel invitation, everybody makes their own decisions. We decide. When it comes to your soul, you're the one. As it say in modern society, it says you're the man. Well, you are. We even say that to women, you're the man. You're the one who makes the decision. You have control. You decide. Your soul is in your hands. God placed it there. Nothing else you own, He placed there. Everything else is kind of at arm's length. He controls it. You don't. But your soul, He gave to you. You decide. Something to think about as together we stand as we sing.